Let's be real. The most painful part of vibe coding isn't actually writing the prompts, it's when things actually break. You get an error, the app doesn't work, and you have no clue where to even start with untangling it. But what makes the process of debugging in vibe coding so challenging for so many is not having a good understanding of the fundamentals. Listen, the fact is, we now all have access to incredibly powerful technologies available to us at our fingertips. But here's the thing. You can't successfully operate a rocket ship without knowing basic physics. So similarly, you're not going to be able to vibe code well without understanding the very basics. But not to worry, we are going to fix that together, starting with understanding the difference between the front end and the back end of your application. In this video, I will give you the simplest mental model for how your app actually works. So the next time things break, you'll know exactly where to look and how to start fixing it. Let's get started. All right, so here is the plan for this video. First, I'll give you a very broad overview of what front end versus back end actually means in plain English. From there, we will see it in action, and we'll see it in action in two ways. First, we will use a very familiar example for all of us, the ChatGPT interface, and then we'll dive a little deeper and actually see this in action with one of the apps that we built in our earlier video, the Affirmations app. If you haven't seen that, go check it out. By the end of this, you will have a mental model for understanding the vibe coding process just a little bit clearer. So hopefully it becomes a little less frustrating. Let's dive in. Now, if you don't know me, I'm Sunny. I'm a serial founder now on my fourth startup. I'm also a former senior engineer at Bloomberg and Shopify, and I'm also an adjunct professor at Columbia Business School where I teach technology. Listen, I've been in this industry for over a decade, well before AI, and I've made all the mistakes so you don't have to. I'm here to help you actually get your idea out into the world. Let's get started. All right, so let's start with one of the most fundamental concepts, the request-response cycle. This is pretty much the heartbeat of every application, whether it's a web app or an app on your phone. Think of it like a conversation between our front end and our back end. So the back end application is the server. This is where all the business logic actually runs. Things like authenticating users, saving data, and also fetching data as well. So backends are built with technologies like Node, Rails, Python, Go, and they basically talk to databases like Postgres or MySQL. Now, if you haven't actually heard of any of those technologies, no worries. If you have maybe heard of them in passing, just know that these are generally related to back-end applications. That's all you really need to know at this point. The most important takeaway, though, is that when we think of our back-end applications, just remember that this is where persistence lives. So when you refresh the page, the reason why the data is still there is because it's saved in a database on your backend. So that's a very, very important concept to remember, persistence. So we covered the back end. Now, what about the front end? So the front end application is really what runs in your browser. So that's usually technologies like HTML, CSS, JavaScript. So JavaScript is particularly important because that is the language that makes things interactive in your front end application. It's why buttons actually click. It's why forms submit. It's why animations actually move. It's basically causing all of that to happen. Also, another very important thing to remember is you'll often hear about something called React, also known as React.js or React Native, all kind of used somewhat interchangeably. That's nothing more but a very, very popular way of writing JavaScript and is very widely used right now. So you will absolutely want to have a broad understanding of what React means because it's such an important part of many of the applications that we're currently vibe coding, but more on that later. But here's the kicker. Most important part to remember of front end is when you refresh that page, the front end doesn't actually remember anything by itself. Without the back end, it's basically a goldfish. It doesn't remember anything. There is no persistence. So very simply, to sum everything up, the front end asks a question and the back end answers. That is the request response cycle. It is simply a back and forth conversation between the back end and the front end. All right, so that's a lot of concepts to throw at you in one go. So let's actually go through a simple example to kind of illustrate what we just learned. Let's go to one of the most familiar interfaces to all of us, the prompt for ChatGPT, and let's actually give it a dead simple prompt. What I'm going to say is finish this sentence once upon a time and hit enter. All right, so the prompt goes in and I get a response from ChatGPT. Now let's redo this, but with a little bit more context under the hood. So I'm going to copy this prompt. I'm going to paste it here. So when we land on this page, what we're actually seeing is the loading up of a front-end application in my browser. In this case, it is a React application, and it's being loaded up in my browser. So when I type in this prompt right here, what I'm doing is I'm typing it into an input box that sits on the front end of the application. Now, when I click send, though, or enter, what we're actually seeing happen is the front-end application is taking that input and it's sending it over to the backend. That is the request part of the request response cycle. Once that happens, that request is then received by the backend, in this case, ChatGPT's server, and then that server will then send back a response. Well, first, it'll run the request, this input, through the AI models, which currently sit on the back end of this entire application. And then it'll assemble a response and send it back to my front end. My front end will then take that response and then render it for human consumption, render it for us to view on the page. So that second part is the response part of it. Now, of course, ChatGPT is way more complex under the hood than our little demo here, but breaking it down in this way makes the request response cycle just a little bit more clear. Granted, we're at a very, very high level of abstraction here. Now, that same pattern is at play in all the apps that we build. So what we're going to do now is we're going to actually look at one of the apps that we built in one of the previous videos together, specifically the Affirmations app. So let's take a look. So here is what we built in the very first video. Again, if you haven't seen it, feel free to check it out, but not a requirement for this video. So a quick recap, this application can do two things. It will allow a user to log in. So we'll see that in action. Actually, I'm already logged in, but let me log out just to demo. So I'm going to log in. This is my fake email that I created. Password is password. Logging in here. We can ignore these annoying things. So I've logged in. Also, it allows the user to see a very simple dashboard. Most importantly, we see this affirmation right here. There's a lot of other stuff, but we'll ignore that for now. So super, super simple, but let's go deeper and talk a little bit more about the architecture. So going back to Lovable, our front-end code is actually in React. So let's actually take a look at where that lives. If you click on this little icon here, you can go to code mode in Lovable and actually see the code itself. So what we see here is the actual React code. This is all the front end. Now, remember, React is just simply a very, very popular way of writing JavaScript code. So all of this is actually just straight up JavaScript. Now, don't be scared. I know a lot of people, when they see this stuff, they kind of freak out. But this is just code. It controls everything that you see in the browser. So things like clicking on buttons, forms, cards, all of that is responsible. All of that the front end is responsible for. But also, in addition to being responsible for what the user sees, it is also responsible for talking to the backend when it needs to. Now, if you remember, in our first video, we set up the backend in Supabase. So if we actually take a look here, all of this code that's currently in this folder, Supabase, is essentially responsible for talking to our backend code. So let's actually also take a look at the backend. So this should also be familiar to you if you saw that first video. This is everything related to Supabase. So essentially everything related to our backend. We can configure stuff around authentication. We can also see all the data here. So everything is over here. You can see this is our data. Our affirmations all live here. So again, to sum up, the React code is our front end. This is what Lovable actually generates. And our backend is Supabase. And together, they make the entire application experience work. So now that we have a broad understanding of where our front end is and where our back end is in this application, let's go a little deeper. Specifically, I want us to see how the back end and the front end talk to each other in real time. So what we're going to do first is we're going to demonstrate the login flow again. I'm already logged in, so I'm actually going to sign out. And I'm going to refresh the page. So what is actually happening right now is, specifically when I hit this get started, is our front end is loading this login form. That is the front end's job. That is not the back end's job. Also just capturing this input. So I'm putting in my credentials here, password. This is all front end stuff. The back end is not involved yet. Now, when I click this sign in button, what's going to happen is our front end is going to take those credentials and assemble it into a request and send it to our backend. In this case, it's going to be Supabase's servers that are going to receive that request. Supabase will then authenticate, meaning it'll take those credentials, check to see if that user exists. And if the user exists, it'll check to see if the password I provided matches. And once it does that, once those two checks are done, it'll send back the request to indicate that we have successfully authenticated. And then the front end will take that in and it'll redirect us to a logged in view. So that is essentially what's happening on the login flow. So, but also, if I refresh the page again, I want to also talk about this logged in UI view. So when we refresh the page, again, the actual rendering is coming from the front end, but it is automatically talking to the back end because there's some pieces of information on here that is coming from our database, specifically our affirmations, which comes from this affirmations table. So our front end is assembling a request to grab that from the back end, a random affirmation. But also, there's also these two pieces of information which is related to the logged in user. So our front end is assembling another request to our back end, specifically from the users table to get the current streak and the longest streak. So we can actually see that information on my profiles table. If I scroll to the right, you'll see here that we have our current streak and our longest streak. And just to put a fine point on it, now if I update anything in the back end, this will update automatically. So right now we have 2 and 2. Let's change this to 3 and 1. And now you'll see that our front end has been dynamically updated because it essentially did another fetch from the backend. So why does this all matter? Because if you are vibe coding with AI, this distinction between front end and back end is the difference between utter frustration and a smooth workflow. As we all know, the worst part of vibe coding is when things break. And after talking to so many vibe coders, I've seen when they get an error or when something doesn't work, this is the most frustrating part. Now, if you don't know the difference between front end and back end, though, this whole thing can feel like a total tangled mess. But once you have this mental model, at least you can say, okay, is this issue coming from the front end or is it coming from the back end? That question alone cuts the problem in half and makes debugging so much less painful. The thing is, we all have access to some incredibly powerful technologies, and we all want to move super fast. But here's the deal. Understanding those basics can get you a long way. Now, I'm not saying you need an advanced CS degree here, but having understanding of the fundamentals can be incredibly powerful. Thank you all who stuck through this video through the end. I will see you in the next video.